So we start? Okay, good. Martyn, welcome to Worth Talking. And it is worth talking about religious freedom. But let's start with, what is it you do? And this is what you live and breathe on a daily basis almost. Tell us what you do.
Well, I'm the Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, and the motto of the Australian Christian Lobby is truth made public. And I think in a nutshell, that's what we try and do. We try to stand in the public squares, which means that we engage politics, we engage the political process, but also we use social media, mainstream media, all those channels to be a voice for truth in the public squares. But importantly, it's not just about me or us working at ACL, but we are actually a grassroots movement representing that ideal, which means that there's 150,000 supporters of ACL. That makes us about the second, I think, as far as I can tell, the second largest political movement in Australia, and that's growing. And it means that we provide a platform for ordinary Christians in this country who have a concern about what's going on in the public squares and have a concern about the fact that, as the scriptures say, truth has stumbled in those public squares. We give them a platform to raise their voice collectively and in a strategic way for truth.
Okay, well, let's go into the heart of it. Why is religious freedom important?
Well, because at its heart, religious freedom is really freedom for the truth. Because it means what? It means freedom for us as Christians, as a religious group, to proclaim truth, to organise ourselves around truth in churches or schools or charities that stand for truth, or indeed to raise our families in accordance with our own values, in accordance with the truth, or to, freedom of conscience is another aspect of it. It's all those things really that describe the outworking of truth in our lives and through our different institutions. And of course it matters therefore, because it's interesting, there's one passage in the New Testament that really I find helpful on this. And that's when Paul instructs Timothy to pray in 1 Timothy 2. And he says, pray for kings and all who are in high positions, that we might lead peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness. It's really interesting to me. I mean, I don't think I'm putting words in Paul's mouth to say that sounds a lot like a prayer for religious freedom, because make sure the godly life, the life of the Christian, the life that we're trying to lead here, in which the gospel is proclaimed, in which the church is flourishing, make sure it's a peaceful life. We should pray for that. A lot of people almost wish for persecution as if it would be some magic bullet to revival. But no, that's a foolish thing to wish for. It's a foolish thing to pray for. What we should pray is for that freedom. Why? He says, because this is good and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Saviour, who desires all people everywhere to come to a knowledge of the truth.
Because freedom is a basic human right, and within general freedom for every human being, by the same token, it is a religious freedom, it is a Christian freedom, it is a freedom for all other religions at the same time, isn't it? It is God given, if you will. And so therefore, protecting it needs to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, if we take just the rights-based argument, if somebody isn't free to believe, they're not free to do anything.
Yes.
Because your speech, what do you talk about but for what you actually believe? What do you associate around? What are your churches based on, or your schools based on, or your political parties based on if it's not beliefs? What do you express if it isn't belief? Freedom of expression in terms of the artistic expression or the whatever you do in the pursuit of it all rests upon that belief system. And so it's something that's very, very important to an understanding of Western democracy, and there's a good reason for that. It's as you describe. It's a good thing for people, and it's a good thing to promote truth.
Make a sense for me of a recent Australian history, and maybe even a Western world. I've lived in Australia for the last 24 years. I come from former Yugoslavia. And I can now with certainty say that something has changed. And we all know that something has changed. what has changed? What are some of the watershed events that kind of propelled us and brought us where we are, where we really have a sense that we have to kind of fight for it, for something that maybe some decades ago we didn't have to. So what are some of the watershed events that you think, or catalysts that propelled us and brought us where we are now?
Well, there's no doubt the one that's freshest in our memory would be the passage of same-sex marriage. I think that had a more profound impact on our society than most people have realised. That was definitely a big target for those who were pushing for change. But of course, you've said, this is something that's been coming for a long time. And it's been coming for a long time through the steady erosion of social values, through the steady change of how we think about moral questions. I think a lot of it is the sexual revolution. A lot of it is the breaking down of those moral standards. A lot of it also is the growth of ideologies that are opposed to Christianity and to Christ himself. You think, for example, of one of the most significant ideas impacting our society today is postmodernism. And at the very heart and centre of postmodernism is the doctrine of postmodernism that truth isn't real. Now you can think straight away, whoa, what a massive opposition that is to Christianity itself, that says, great is truth and mighty above all things. In fact, it was Jacques Derrida, one of these postmodernist guys, who wrote, well, one of the problems with the West is that it's logos-centric. And we who are Christians know exactly what the logos is. It's not only Christ, but it is the organising and informing truth that lies behind the universe. It's God himself. And Derrida said, I'm attacking that with my idea. And that idea has taken hold, particularly through education and the institutions.
Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that.
Yes, he does.
When he's saying logos, that's what
right.
Western society it was based on, Judeo-Christian values in a way.
He's
isn't
right.
it? So it is ideologies, maybe ideologies with their roots in humanism, in rationalism, and secularism especially atheism, and then Marxism after that.
Yes.
Those are the roots.
Yes, and even beyond that, I think I've been doing a lot of reading of people who are saying, well, where are we really headed? What's coming next? Like, if we sit right at that front row seat of the cutting edge of culture and we look forward, where's it going? And I would say even there's flavours of paganism coming in, because I think secular humanism and atheism and all this, killed God, as Friedrich Nietzsche said. God is dead. In the West, we don't need him anymore. It's all about rationalism. It's all about people as the measure of all things. Forget about God. And we saw that play out, for 200 years. But Nietzsche always predicted that there'd be something else to take his place. And it seems indeed that the younger generation now, and certainly when I went through school it would have been starting in earnest, but I think it's very strong now, is being taught really to worship the self, the identity, the inner person, the worth of the self, the discovery of the self, the good life, the happy life. The greatest thing you can do is to look within, see who you are, and live it out, which is kind of the opposite of the Christian view of the world, right? Which says, no, who we ought to be is outside of us. It's God, he sets the standard, and we look up to something transcendent. So there's almost a self-worship. It's Romans 1, worship and serve creature rather than creator. That's coming in very, very strongly in a new generation.
Yes. And some of those catalyst events would be, as you said, the redefinition of marriage. What happened in the United States was huge, wasn't it? As well as what happened here.
Absolutely.
And as you said, it was a sexual revolution of 60s, and drastic change in of marriage institution and morality. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's useful to think about here is it's, we can get a little bit high level and philosophical about it, but what really changed since the 60s was there was a group of people who were deeply impacted by all the ideas we just described. And they got together and said, well, how can we make sure that this idea is not a crazy thing that everyone rejects, but is normal? And they got together and they just decided to put their head down, and with tremendous zeal, they pursued through institutions, they pursued these ideas, and they were very, very clever about about it. So what we've actually seen, particularly in Australia in the last 20 years, is groups of activists who have been incredibly zealous for their cause and have pushed hard, particularly in the political sphere. They've known, for example, that they're a minority, that their ideas were not welcome in Australia, and so they thought, okay, so in order to get change, we have to be very busy. We have to actually be the people that pick up the phone and ring the senator. We have to be the people that actually put the t-shirt on and get into the street and knock on the door. We have to be the people who coordinate ourselves to attack that Facebook page when they do something wrong and behave like bigots. They got incredibly organised, and from a minority position, even in the days when their victories were 0.5%, 1%, they were just making tiny progress. They kept going, they kept going, they kept going, and then they started to win some massive strongholds like same-sex marriage, for example, and they've continued to plough forward, and now those ideas that were once insane are now mainstream, and it's because of the zeal of those people. And I just raise that because I think to myself, you know what, as Christians, surely our zeal should match theirs.
That's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about what does this say about us,
Exactly.
in terms of are we caught sleeping? Is what's happening with Royal Commission has really blunted the edge of a message, of a Christian message in a way, and generally being asleep, as the Book of Revelation would say. You know, we just neither warm, nor you are neither hot nor cold, but just
Lukewarm.
that lukewarmness. You know, so. Would that be, you know?
I think that's exactly right. And, you know, often I was speaking somewhere just last weekend in New South Wales, and someone came up to me and said, you know, that talk has really convicted me of the sin of silence. And the truth is, as the external pressure has pushed in on people like us who are Christians, so often we've walked backwards as it's pushed us backwards. And when they've come to us and said things like, you don't really believe that horrible business that homosexuality is sinful, and we've gone, oh yeah, it's more complicated than that, yeah, and we sort of hop around. Or when the government comes out and says, you know what, you need to jump through this regulatory loophole now, and it means that you can't openly proselytise in a school, or tries to put restrictions on Christian groups. So often we've gone, yep, okay, no worries, we'll change. And so we've been forced slowly into a box.
So in other words, there is a sense of those zealous activists who are on the attack.
That's right.
And who are convinced for what they believe in. And on the other hand, all we have been doing is just defending and giving in.
Yes. I think there's been a lack of conviction. You know, if we really believed that the things we carry, whether it's the power of a converted life, whether it's the Word of God, the truth that we've been given, if we really believed that was the answer, not the problem, we wouldn't walk backwards. But of course, one of the things that postmodernism has taught us is that it's arrogant to claim that you know the truth. You know, there's lots of people have different ideas, and we've got to be very, you know, accommodating, and we can't, and that's played out very strongly in our psyche, and so it's weakened us. But all the while we've been affected by these ideas, these zealous opponents of truth. They've not been watered down at all. They've been very strong, and sometimes I feel like giving them credit for an incredibly brilliantly done job, as much as it's dreadful and it's been a wicked cause that they've been pushing, but they've had unbelievable success.
You have kind of, at least for now, dedicated your life to protect, not only protect, but to promote, because it's worth promoting the Christian values. Let's go into that.
Yes.
What are some of the Christian values and Christian truths or doctrines that are special and that are important, not only to be defended, but to be promoted, but are at the same time on the attack? What are some of the Christian truths, values, and doctrines that are on the attack, but are worth preserving and worth promoting and worth...
I think so many of them, if you look at what are sometimes called the creation ordinances, you find a lot of them there. You see God setting in order a world that is set for human flourishing, that is set for people to enjoy all that's good and wonderful that He's made. And there's a number of things in that creation narrative that are clearly spelled out. For example, marriage is ordained there and then, one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others for life. Also, the idea of family is ordained there, and the family is under attack in incredible ways, and has been probably for 100 years in the West. And some bitter fruit of that is being born now. You see also in that family, a subset of family is life itself. You see God authoring life, and indeed when John describes what happens, he says in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. But also he made reproduction, and He made that. So all of the things around, I guess, sex, gender, family, life, marriage, those things which are fundamental to the very matrix of the universe. And God says, I've set these things in place so that to follow them is life itself and peace and all that's good. And to depart from them is really not only wrong before God, but it is actually destructive. And we're destroying our world by pretending that we can be the creators now and we can change those things.
And our mandate is not just to protect and to defend. The mandate given by Jesus is be light.
Yes.
And be the salt.
Yes.
And therefore, it's not just for the sake of protection, it's for the sake of society, which is the changes that would come would definitely be detrimental to society. So the mandate has to be taken seriously.
Definitely. And I think what you've touched on there is something that I try and say to people, where I think that there's been a period of time, particularly for those of us who are younger in the West, where we've almost become numb to the cost of evil, the cost of losing these things. We think, for example, well, maybe a bit of persecution will be a good thing, not realizing for a second what that means. If you allow these ideologies to take hold, the darkness that will come in off the back of that, the pain and the hurt that will be wreaked on a society. You think, for example, of children growing up in a situation where their families are broken, where they are told from primary school that the right thing to do with your sexuality and your gender is to explore, experiment and discover, and I'm quoting from school resources, and that they're going to actually go and follow that advice, and then they're going to, you get to a point where you think, this is dark. People are suffering because of these bad ideas, because these things are not being protected. And so I'm not in this for me. I'm in this for neighbour. Love of God and love of neighbour, for it's God's way and it's our neighbours' lives that are at risk.
Yes. If you don't have to have a crystal ball, I guess. What does the future hold for us? You pessimist? Optimist?
Well, ultimately I'm an optimist because I've read the book and I know how it ends. God is in control.
Yes.
I'm ultimately an optimist. Look, I think really, and I say this as someone who is very up close and personal with the politics and the cultural moves and the legislative moves that are afoot. I find it very hard to envisage a future for Christians in Australia that does not contain pretty significant persecution. I find that hard to see. I just think that's likely. I think to be a Christian in our society, the days of that being a costless exercise are gone. I think it will cost us, and we need to get our head into that gear where we know that if we are publicly faithful to Christ, we will lose much in this world. I think that must be true for a lot of good reasons. However, obviously God is outside the system and he can change it like that if his people do the things that he asks him to do at any given time. And I do think that there's an opportunity for the church, which is still enormous in this country, to be the salt and light publicly, and to hold back that tide, and even to do a great deal of good by being publicly faithful to Christ in the calling to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth. But I do think that the hostility that we will face is going to increase.
So the change that has taken place is just going to speed up, and we'll feel it. I, as a church pastor, may as well feel it soon. So how is church, how is clergy, how are priests, how are the pastors going to be affected? Tell me, give me some more of that.
So I think for clergy and pastors, so I think that where we're at the moment is that the pressure is being put on those who are in public. So I think, so there's an Israel Folau situation we can talk about. There's a guy who's been made an example of because of his public expression of his faith. That's very common, actually. He's just been in the media and the news because he's high profile. It's very common for people in the workplace. It's very common for people who have professional accreditations with bodies like medical accreditations or counselling or other things that are out there. I think that that's where it's at now. But people make the mistake of thinking, well, if we just go a little bit quiet in those areas, we can almost retreat and regroup within our churches and they won't come here. Well, they definitely will come here. And I think that the problem pastors face is now on that legislative, on those moves in legislation to increasingly restrict speech. Because so much of what Christians believe is increasingly being considered, or they're trying to get it defined as hate speech. And there are hate speech laws in Australia already. Some jurisdictions like Tasmania, they're very, very serious indeed. If you stood on the street, or in fact if someone walked into your church and heard you preach on Romans 1 or something like this, you'd definitely be infringing hate speech laws. So parts of the Bible are already illegal in Tasmania. There's no doubt about that. Those sorts of laws we saw, for example, the Shadow Attorney General just yesterday came out and said that he wants to beef up the watchdog who enforces those sort of speech codes federally. And that's almost a sure thing to happen. And increasingly, it won't just be Israel Folau who's caught out, but it will be even pastors, and indeed anybody, lay people who want to do any kind of Christian ministry will be caught out for as small as crime as quoting a Bible verse, or indeed in many of the cases we're seeing, responding to questions about their beliefs when asked. And that has caused a lot of people I'm aware of who we've helped legally to lose their jobs and things like that. So there's a huge concern there.
Isn't it good to have the case of Israel Folau and even Margaret Court, just to kind of show us where we as society have come to?
Yes.
To me, they are like a defining moment, like a litmus test, where we as a society, how far we have gone, and do we really like where we have gone? Alan Jones, in his editorial in Australian, was basically saying that this is a defining moment for Australia as far as religious freedom is concerned. You agree with that?
Definitely, and I did an interview today with the Managing Director of the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is ACL's legal firm that does a lot of these cases. And he was telling me that there's a way in which actually Israel Folau's case is every Christian's case, because the implications of this case affect us all. The question really is, can you be fired for quoting a Bible verse in your private time? That's the question.
This is a test time.
Exactly. And if the answer is yes, which it could well be, that tells us something about where we are as a society, and it tells us something about what the point I made before. What will it cost us to be faithful to Christ publicly in this society? We need to get real about that and realise that when Jesus says that, to follow him is part of what it takes is to take up your cross and follow him and to bear the offence of Christ. There's a little bit of that going on in our society, which we haven't seen for a while in the West, but that definitely is coming true.
What about Christian schools? Well, this church and this studio, if you will, is situated on school grounds. And what's the future for Christian schools?
Challenging, very challenging. We've done a lot of work in this zone. At the end of last year, the Australian Labor Party put up a policy in the Senate, a law, and what they wanted to do was essentially the legal changes, what the effect they would have had would have been that faith-based schools would have been open to litigation, and in fact they would have been sued for teaching the Bible or for having policies in their school that reflect their Christian beliefs, like let's say, boys use the boys' toilets and girls use the girls' toilets. I mean, it's getting to that these days. Or indeed who have their own ethos embedded into the curriculum, they would have been sued for that, there's no doubt. And it really opened the way for the end of Christian schooling as we know it, because they would not have been able to continue to promote and enforce their ethos. And in fact, Labor have promised that if they win this election, they won't only bring that back, but they'll go further. They will actually pass a law which means that Christian schools, it's unlawful for them to select staff based on whether or not they'll uphold the values and the ethos of the school. So it makes it very difficult to create a Christian environment if you're not allowed to restrict your employment to Christians or people who will uphold the code of conduct. So I think Christian schools face a future in which their continuation is going to be very difficult. Certainly they'll be significantly changed compared to what we see today.
Senator Wong,
Yes.
the Labor senator, recommended a legislation and that did not pass.
Mm-hmm.
But if it did,
We'd be sort of where I described. And it didn't pass I was up close with some of the political negotiations that were taking place at that time. Let me tell you, it nearly passed. It was as close as anything has ever come to passing, and it was a miracle that it did not. It will be back. It will be back because they have committed to this. And it's really sad. They come out of the public square and they will say, vehemently and almost through gritted teeth, the reason we're doing this is to stop gay kids from being expelled from school. Now, the problem is that's not happening. There are no faith-based school movements. They all came out and said, well, we don't do that. It doesn't happen. What are you talking about? And so you say, well, why are they pushing for it? And you look in the detail, and it is as I said. What it means is that Christian schools won't be able to teach the Bible. They won't be able to teach Christian views on anything relating to at least gender and sexuality, probably a range of other things. And they won't be able to have policies in the schools that just reflect their Christian ethos. That's the real cost of it.
because of potential offence on some
Exactly.
within school,
It comes down to what the discrimination codes. So it comes down
and
to
then it
somebody else.
boils down to hate speech,
Exactly, those sorts of things.
and it's
yes.
nothing else but the promotion or expressing of beliefs.
Because wasn't it in her bill said something about causing detriment to a student or a teacher?
Correct. So that reflects a cultural shift, right? So essentially someone could sue the school because they say you caused me detriment. And once upon a time the notion that teaching a Christian view of human sexuality was somehow detrimental would be madness. But today that's absolutely accepted. And in fact we've had cases where that's been decided. And so it is the causing of detriment. It's that very general and uncertain language in the legislation that makes you go, well, that could mean anything. Anyone could sue for any reason, and there's plenty of activists out there waiting to sue because they don't like the fact that Christian schools exist. And I think it's as simple as this. I went to a Christian school, and there were people in my year level at school who were not Christians when they joined the school, and they didn't come from Christian families, but by the time they left the school, they were Christians. I mean, I know one guy, for example, who's a pastor in Brisbane because he was converted at school. And so you see so much opportunity. You see the cost of losing religious freedom. The cost of losing religious freedom is that the truth itself is not proclaimed in certain ways, and it's important that we keep it open.
I don't want to over-dramatise or overstate things, but I'm reminded of Martyn Niemöller, who spent 7 years in a Nazi concentration camp, and I'm not comparing, what happened there to now or whatever, but he was famous post the war for saying that first they came for the socialists. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came after me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And we seem to be going down a very slippery slope in Australia and right across the West. And you mentioned before that a lot of Christians seem to just insulate themselves or not speak out. But I think right now that Christians do need to speak out in a respectful manner. I mean, we according to the census, we're still the majority in this country, but we're still the majority. How can Christians get involved? How can Christians start to make a difference and change that culture? Because you said that those activists have got very organised. How can we as a Christian movement get organised and to start pushing back and to changing that culture back in Australia?
Well, I think one of the first principles that I often refer to is I say, look, the more we are silent, the more we will be silenced. The problem is that when you retreat and you give ground, people can just walk. The other side just gets to walk forward. And for a long time, we've done that because we listen to the world's challenges when they say, but you're not loving people by speaking up, but you're not being compassionate by speaking up. We've believed that. It isn't true. But because nobody wants to, particularly as a Christian, you don't want to be seen as unloving. So you shut your mouth. And there's all sorts of codes of silence that are imposed. And I think a large part of the problem we have is because we as Christians self-censor. We don't speak up. We don't stand out. It's interesting, I was reading a survey. I can't actually remember the percentages, but there was a mighty gulf between them. And the survey just asked people, do you know someone who's homosexual? And a huge majority of people said yes. And then the next question was, do you know someone who identifies as a Christian? And the result was drastically lower. Now, the reason I raise that is just because that's statistically impossible. There are way more Christians knocking around this society in Australia. Way more. It's just a question of who's obvious, who's proud of who they are, who's telling the story publicly and as they rub shoulders with their neighbours and colleagues and so on. Well, it turns out it's not the Christians. And we're getting away with it. I realised how much I got away with it before I took this job, because in Australia, when you meet someone new, the first question they ask is, where do you work? What do you do? And so I suddenly had to declare myself. And so I work for the Australian Christian Lobby. And it hit me then in 2014. I thought, I've been getting away with it for a long time. I've been hiding in plain sight. And I think that vacuum has created so much opportunity. And now we feel like that we're being pushed aside. We feel like that everything's advancing against us. But that actually isn't true. For ACL to be the second largest political movement in the country, for 1.8 million Australians to be going to church every week, let alone the 51% who will clearly sympathise with Christianity, at least if they put it on their census form, in fact, the opportunity is huge. And so we need to ask ourselves, where do we begin to push back if the opportunity is huge? I mean, we can let it keep shrinking. That's one option. But another option, I think it actually starts personally with that courage. And I think the New Testament is a story.
That's the word.
Courage and boldness. And the New Testament is a world in which courage and boldness are exemplified in the witness and testimony and walk of the apostles, for example. And to see how what they did they just pushed the gospel forward through a hostile world like madness.
And regardless of the consequences, wasn't it?
Exactly. Regardless, I've been reading Acts lately, just afresh, and I feel like such a coward. These guys, they're hauled into the Sanhedrin, which I call the ancient anti-discrimination tribunal. They're told to shut up, just like people are today, and they leave and they get together and pray, and they pray for boldness to continue. They just push on.
Exactly, because as for a Christian, the kingdom of God is just incomparable to any other kingdom, to any other political party, to anything else, and the values espoused in the gospel are just simply incomparable. Once it grabs you, you can't but be a proponent and a herald of it.
Yes.
And so you're right. Courage is the word. Courage is the word.
And without courage and courage is the flower of conviction as well. So without those things, we can't even get started on the solution. Yeah.
And it's huge. Your role is mightily important. But what happens at the individual level of a Christian, at the local church level, is of such a huge importance. We do matter individually. We do matter as local churches.
Definitely.
And we do, at the end of the day, we do cast a vote. And I think there needs to be an enlightenment of us as individually as Christians, which are the parties that kind of reflect maybe a little better than the others, the Christian values. And to tell you the truth, that's not easy. Sometimes, almost as a joke, I would vote for a fishing party or something. I don't know, just for my Protestant vote, because enlighten us a little bit on that one. What are the parties out there? We are going to have elections soon. Well, what a timing to have an interview with you, my friend.
Yeah, we are going to have an election soon. This is true.
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the challenges people have to start with is, well, what is the Christian issue this election? How do you determine what is a Christian policy platform? I believe very earnestly that it has to start with religious freedom, because a government's ministry, according to Scripture, is to punish that which is evil and reward that which is good. That's in 1 Peter 2, that's in Romans 13, that's actually in the Old Testament as well. It's everywhere. And if a government's doing that job, then it means that the truth, it means that that which is good will be free. It means that the church will be able to do its job. It means that Christian believers will be able to speak up and witness and not be punished for it, as so many people are. We have people who speak up in the free speech cases and are punished as if they're wrongdoers. That wouldn't be happening. And so we need to consider that value system, largely because if that's in place, then the very mandate of the Christian and the church, the spread of the gospel and the truth, will be possible. And that's got to be where it all begins and ends ultimately. If we're actually now in a phase of Australian politics where we're talking about the freedom of the gospel itself, come on, that's got to be the litmus test. So I think that we start there and work our way out. And it's true, neither of the major parties have shown a great deal of keenness to pursue the religious freedom issue. We're being offered what I call some fig leaves from the coalition government, but it really doesn't amount to much, honestly, what they've promised. However, there is a difference of attitude to these issues between the major parties. And this is a huge thing for me to actually say publicly, because we are a non-party partisan movement, but the difference of attitude is actually so profound that I have to say it. And that is that from the coalition, the government, Scott Morrison, there is far more sympathy to the issue. In fact, it was Scott Morrison who moved many of the amendments to the Marriage Act at the time, which enshrined religious freedom, but didn't pass, but he pushed hard. So he has a conviction about this. He's willing to lose some political skin over this. He has a sympathetic ear on these issues, even though the party itself hasn't put up great policies. But the attitude from the opposition, the Australian Labor Party, couldn't be more different. Every ALP politician I have spoken to, I think that's right to say, there may be one or two exceptions, but as I speak to them, there is nothing but denial that there is even a problem. There is nothing but contempt for the issue. They just don't care, they won't listen, and they can't get you to stop talking about it fast enough.
And really behind the attitude there is a certain philosophy, and there is a certain kind of even ideology.
Yes, for sure.
So therefore you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that.
Correct. Yeah.
And earlier, Steve, you mentioned to me exactly along those issues that yeah, go on.
Yeah, well, look, it worries me. So our two major political parties, one of them will form government. Minor parties won't be able to form government in their own right. So it's going to be Labor or Liberal. Now, we've seen as of yesterday what the opposition Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, had to say regarding beefing up the Discrimination Act and talking about hate speech and whatnot. We've seen Penny Wong's bill. Tanya Plibersek said something on that yesterday. But then if you have a look at Labor's National Conference in December last year, their agenda. I've got it here. Their 224-page document. There are 64 mentions of sexual orientation, such as intersex, LGBTI, transgender, bisexual, lesbian, gay, transphobia. There was a whopping 138 mentions of gender, 27 mentions of diversity, and 42 mentions of identity. That, to me...
So you're saying that that's what that really dominated the conversation?
That seems to be sweeping through the Labor Party, and where's the focus on the economy, on taxation, on living costs, and the normal bread and butter workers' jobs. What Labor has been known for. It seems that this whole cultural Marxism has not just gone around all the institutions, but now it's going through the Labor Party as well, and that concerns me.
Yeah, look, is what Pastor Zenny said about the ideology that lies behind this, and it is a Marxist style, informed a lot by queer issues, LGBT. That really is what's there. That platform mentions cost of living 5 times, and to read it, some of the policies in there. If we had time to go into them, they just stick your hair on end. It's quite extraordinary what they're proposing in so many of those policies, and there is an ideology that rests behind this religious freedom issue, and we can't be numb to that. And ideologies tend to have force. They tend to have energy. They tend to be pushing in a particular direction, and the push is in the wrong direction. The coalition's not squeaky clean by any means, but you mentioned people get they think it's hopeless to vote for a minor party because they won't win government. But where that's not true is in the Senate.
Yes.
And I do think there's a huge opportunity. The Senate keeps an eye on the government.
Yes.
They're the watchdog. They don't let things through the gate if they're bad. You could have the worst government in the universe and they can't get through the Senate, because if you had a range of people in the Senate who were Christians or who had very strong Christian values from parties like Australian Conservatives, Katter's Australia Party, Australian Christians, these sorts of, and indeed the Nationals themselves for those rural areas are really great. So there's a range of parties who, if they were in that category called the crossbench, not Liberal, not Labor, not Green, could wield enormous influence over the religious freedom agenda. So it's not a lost cause to vote for those people at all.
Yes, and that's where I really feel that this election is just vitally important for Christians, and to understand how our parliament works, and as you say with the Senate, if we can have those Christian conservatives, so to speak, on that crossbench, then they can prevent a lot of these bills coming from the Labor Party and the Greens.
Yes.
So just share with us this flyer that the ACL has done up here.
Yes.
Can you talk about it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things ACL does is that we campaign in the field. So we actually send volunteers into marginal electorates to put information in letterboxes and knock on doors and talk to people about issues. It's very effective. We can actually swing the vote in particular marginal seats by doing this. So one of the things we talk about, that courage and conviction, which is part of the solution. But an opportunity to shine the light in a dark place exists with platforms like what ACL provides, where people can get active in the public squares by getting into their communities and going door to door literally and talking to people who are willing to listen about these issues. I've done it myself, and it's actually rewarding to do. And this is one of the toolkit items that they have. They have a number of flyers and things, and this is one of them.
Because a lot of Christians don't know what political party to vote for.
A lot of people are genuinely confused. And there's a lot of people out there who would say, yeah, I want to vote for Christian values, as this flyer says. And most people actually say this is genuinely helpful because now I do have some issues that I care about, which I think are Christian values, and I can see some parties that are good and some parties that are bad. For example...
That's very helpful.
Well, a lot of people might put Darren Hinch's Justice Party down because it says Justice Party, and everyone loves justice. But little do they know, look at all these red X's. I mean, the guy I stand does not stand for Christian values at all, and I can promise you that. And it's all Clive Palmer. It's completely unknown, hence we put him there. But you've got Australian Conservatives with lots of ticks. You've got Liberal National with ticks. You've got Pauline Hanson's One Nation with ticks. I got criticised for that one, but you know what? Give me 10 One Nation senators over 10 Hinch senators or Green senators. Any day of the week, they open the door to you. They listen, and they often make the right decision once they hear the voice of reason. And so this is really in the field to give people some information who otherwise wouldn't know. We've distributed tens of that, more than that, in marginal seats all across Australia in every state. So these sorts of things actually do make a significant difference.
That's helpful. That really is helpful. Well, let's start wrapping it up. And actually, what would be your punchline counsel to us as Christians in times such as this? And along the line of the principle of Jesus, be wise as serpents but innocent as doves. And yet, what would be the one thing that you would counsel us?
I think it comes back to what we said. I would counsel people to be bold and courageous. Know that you have the truth, and that you have the words of Christ ringing in your ears to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth and to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Know that, and also practice it despite the challenges of a changing world. Because I think that by not practicing it in the face of the challenges that are ahead of us, we actually miss out on something. And it's the blessing that Jesus promised when he says, when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account, blessed are you. And I think the apostles of the New Testament, they weren't insane, but their faith was enriched, and they knew Christ, and they grew in an incredible way under the circumstances prevailing in their day. And I just think that if we heed the call of Christ to shine the light in the darkness, and we do so despite what's happening, I just think it'll be a great thing, not only for us, but for our world.
Live the truth, speak the truth in love, and be courageous. Thank you, Martyn. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.